I wanted you guys to come to class with me last week, but then I didn't have some of my settings set up correctly. So then here we are, we're going to go and do it like this. So after having taught 3 weeks using only AI and completely changing the way that I am interfacing with my students with ongoing topics and how I want this to work. This is something that I've been thinking about for a while. So what makes what is required in order for my students to be competitive as the world of work is changing? And I think that's a really tricky topic right now because we don't really know, right? I think partly the bigger issue here is that there isn't a very defined terminology of how we're talking about how AI actually is changing the world of work. We see a lot of reports coming out, the McKinsey report, the MIT report saying that, yes, 95% of businesses do not get a return on investment on using AI. But I think there's a larger gap here that hasn't been addressed, which is the fact that okay, but how are we measuring this? And also, are all the things that are being measured, are they all the same? Meaning that is the McKinsey and the MIT and the OpenAI and the Apple and are they all using a same method of testing to see whether they are collecting data to understand how organizations are currently using AI? My suspicion is that it's probably not, as a person who collects primary data to understand this. And very much this is based on the research that I'm currently writing a proposal for, which is understanding, well, if the industry is talking about it one way, academia is going to talk about it in another way. And then thirdly, where is that gap or where is that bridge between the two? Because that's where I am. I have to be rather agile for my students in order for them to onboard a lot of information. And I've been really thinking about what this would look like in terms of, well, what does that look like? The agility that I can provide my students currently. And I think that's where, I've been watching a lot of things online. I've been looking and etc. And I think my understanding is something like this. I think that the expectation of AI is to increase productivity. But what does that actually look like in real time? I think that we need to reassess what workflow looks like. And yes, there are a lot of reports about people talking mid to senior management having a better time with or having a better return on investment with AI. And if we actually look at it through this idea of workflow, of course that's true because you're coming with your human capital. You're coming in with knowledge and experience, and you know how to go and increase capacity with AI. Whereas if you are just coming out from university, you finished your first degree or second degree, you don't really have a lot of work experience under your belt. It's really tricky to anticipate some of the things that may or may not happen. And so I think that is where people are trying to say or talk about in terms of why that return on investment is low, but then also at the same time, not really being able to have a very succinct way of talking about things. And I think that we really do have to think about what onboarding workflow with it look like. For me, my onboarding workflow currently is something like this, which has been listed out right here. So we start off with your case, your lesson, and then getting into your worksheets, meeting, and then your PRD. I think this is a logic that I can sort of get on board with, just because this is how we teach in business school. So one of the biggest adjustments that I've had to make is just very simply problem-based learning. And I list right off the bat here what is the core issue, and then a very high-level case, and then what the students need to do this week, and then going into the tasks. From there, the case is much more built out. Every one of these case points should then therefore be indicative or help students to pick out the information that's necessary to answer the question at hand, which is the core issue that is listed here. And then also the case should feed into understanding this component of the lesson. And for me, again, because this week is about tech innovation and entrepreneurship, I really wanted for students to recognize that this workflow or this quote unquote change of workflow, which is very much about application, that is where my teaching lands. I want students to recognize that when we are teaching certain frameworks, that it really truly needs to be applied to something. And I think there's a misunderstanding there's a gap between the research that has been conducted and then actually what that means when you get into the world of work. And because AI can do so much of the work for you now, I think trying to go and onboard and applying it into something like a meeting simulation is something that just is much more applicable than, say, like previously. So the students will then therefore look at the lesson to answer the worksheet. The worksheet will then therefore inform how they're going to structure their memo to get into a leadership meeting to really talk about something that is quite straightforward. So that would look something like this. We are in a simulation for a leadership meeting based on what the students have learned in the research based on the case to go and solve the case as to how to create a 90-day pilot. And it's really interesting, again, I think after 3 weeks and onboarding a new flow to think through so little of what it is that you thought was really the one and only thing that you really need to care about, which is research. Actually, by the time you get into a leadership meeting, that research only really is to help leaders understand how to proceed and what to do and whether to proceed or not. And I can really see how, it's a very different way of understanding flow and that pure application of it. So for me, I think this is like what I'm going to be trying for the next little while, which is the workflow here is that the students need to actually understand you are now doing multiple things at once. You need to read the case, which usually are not cases that are fully built out, like say like a Harvard case, which are they take a really long time to go and build the entire case out. It's not that. Like, I'm giving you a few points, which is much more realistic as to what happens, because most of the time when you're working, you don't get most of the information. You can't really work backwards to work forwards. You're sort of working with the information that you have, and then you're working backwards to work sideways or something like that. So you have your case, and then you go into the lesson, whatever topic and whatever it is that we need to cover that week. And then we go into the worksheets, which then really the students are now trying to go and pick the information that is listed within the case, and then going to go and do additional research to really answer like what some of these things are. And once they get enough of the information, they can construct a memo, which will then therefore help direct the leadership meeting to go into a simulation to get some of these questions, which are like completely valid. So, we've set this up here, and we can see that on screen saying, these are the rules. You've got 30 seconds. So what is the opening line that you're going to begin with? And so these are what my student has said that this is the problem. They're going to go and focus on reliability and probability of the memo that was based above. And then they said, okay, fine. So now this is the next thing. So the stakeholder is rather skeptical. And so why should we believe that this experiment won't just become another cost sink given the connectivity gaps and the extreme conditions, which I think is absolutely fair enough. And these were points that we had also talked about throughout, like when we were doing research and explaining the topics and etc. What you can really tell, like, this is much more about a learning teaching experience rather than understanding, say, like copy paste or no, you're not correct. Whereas it's sort of what we may see if we are in an actual like working situation. I think it's a really good way to gesture in to see what it would look like to sit in leadership meetings and having these questions that really are there to get you to think, to understand. It is your job to go and do some research to understand how to answer this question. And very much is about, well, you are looking through the lens of the company. you're not really looking through the lens of yourself or whatnot, because you're hired based on what the needs of the company are. So for now, like, this is what I'm going to be testing to see how that looks for business school. Now, you know, I'm trained as a fine artist. I also consult artists to break down how to get into the art world. And I have a little bit of a different approach when it comes to reorganize some of the information. Still talking about workflows, still trying to understand what to do with this workflow and onboarding information. Just a different grouping of people who I think are also using a very similar mentality to approach research. I think it's just that the flow looks slightly different. So this is what I have been working on for the last little while, which is artists look similarly to a case, but rather than a case that's sort of, again, like fully built out, we are understanding the situation currently, which is a lot of artists have to apply for residencies and grants and whatnot. And similarly, it is a quote unquote case, which I'm going to just call like a situation that we're going to approach and think about what this would look like if the scenario actually was happening in real life, in real time, and how do you use some business skills to analyze or break down the situation. So you can see that I sort of have a really crass way of saying to my bot, like, give me a situation. And it does. Like, I've gone in and I've gone onto the back end, I've built this out list. I've thought about this for the last little while as to what I want this to look like. And the situation is that the Whitney adjacent scene or spaces like Industry City are buzzing with pop-up exhibitions and startup gallery models. Mid-emerging artists are seeing an influx of hybrid artists running commercial pop-ups. Given Gagosian has toyed with pop-up formats, these temporary experiences echo how mid-emerging artists are experimenting with self-organized sales opportunities in commercial contexts. So your situation is, and the reason why it says that it's vague to begin with is because when we were in art school, or when I was in art school, we don't really necessarily get taught the same way as we do in business school, which is going through a lot of framework. Because there is no one way of being an artist. And so the theories that we have to go through are very much dependent on the type of medium that you use. So for me, it was my medium is space. And so that meant that I read a lot of space theory to understand like how to work with space and the interpretation, communication of space, and then understanding a lot of materials. So it starts off with vagueness because that sort of, it's like a funnel system that you're going from like big to small. So the situation is that you're a mid-emerging painter who organized a 2-week pop-up in a small-scale Manhattan storefront. The opening night drew strong foot traffic, some promising leads, but sales stalled after day one. Now you're sitting with gallery costs eating into your thin budget. So analyze the gallery situation. What strategic adjustments could you make using the 6-component business system framework to shift the outcome from failure to breakthrough? Again, like, this is a business foundations class. And what I really like about using or adopting and trying out different workflows is that, to me, they're very similar. They're in parallel in terms of onboarding information. The grouping might be different, meaning that like the participants are different. But for me, it's the same context of understanding 1, workflow, and 2, how to onboard information. And 3, like, as a person who's been teaching full-time in business schools for the last few years, like, I know the way that we like to teach in business school, like there's a structure to it. And then also at the same time, we also teach very specifically in art school as well, which I think that we can all sort of like share this type of information, how to go and break things down, because I think that both sides benefit. And what I'm trying to say is that like, I'm really sort of blending my approach, using my fine art background in experiential teaching and learning and experimental teaching learning, and also applying that into business schools as well to go and see like what that would look like. At least for the short term, I can see that using something as an interface or intermediary with different types of simulation to go and help figure out how to maneuver next is something that I found to be really helpful. So I will see you in the next one.